Good day everyone. In this video, I'm going to report the Module 8 in DRR subject. The title of this module is Effects of Hazard, Exposure, and Vulnerability to Disaster Risk. At the end of this module, you're expected to define hazards, exposure, and vulnerabilities, explain the difference among hazard, exposure, and vulnerabilities, and appreciate the importance of understanding the concepts about hazard, exposure, and vulnerabilities so that it will be applied in everyday situations. The lesson that I'm going to be talking about in this module is the hazards, exposure, and vulnerabilities from actual situations. Now, several countries, including the Philippines, have experienced disasters affecting the property, assets, and lives of Filipino people, especially the COVID-19 pandemic, which killed millions of people not only in the Philippines but worldwide. Today, it is important to be extra cautious and mindful at all the time. The topic will eventually address concepts of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability on how they vary from each other and how important they are. Before we proceed to the topic, let us have an activity. In this activity, you're going to identify the picture of incidents happened in the mining community in Itogon, Benguet after the onslaught of the Typhoon Ampong in 2018 and answer the guide question below. I'll give you 3 minutes to answer the activity. Now we're first going to analyze this picture. This picture is about defining hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. As you can observe on the picture, the rock on the mountain is labeled as potential hazard because it has the potential to inflict injury or damage on the community that is on the bottom of the mountain. Now, here's comes the fun part. As we can see that there is two structures on the picture. The one who's close to the mountain but well structured, and the other one is far on the mountain but low structured. The one that is close to the mountain is labeled as high exposure but low vulnerability. Why? Because yes, the building or structure is high in exposure because the degree to which the people or building or other assets are likely to be affected by a hazard is high since it's close to the mountain that may cause a hazard. However, it is less vulnerable because the building is well structured. The building was made with planning to be strong and survive any hazard that may come from the mountain. Now, the building that is far from the mountain is labeled as low exposure but high in vulnerability. Now, it is low exposure because it's far from the hazard or there is low chance that the building or structure that may affected by the hazard. However, it is high vulnerability because the building is just a normal house. So, when the hazard reach that building, it will have it will be destroyed immediately. It don't have a proper mitigation and not built to withstand a hazard or disaster. Now that we're done with the activity, we're now going to proceed to the topic. Now first, let's define hazard. Hazard is a harmful condition, substance, human behavior or condition that can cause loss of life, injury or other health effects, harm to property, loss of livelihood and services, social and economic disruption or damage to the environment. Any risk which is imminent is threat. Now, in short, events or circumstances that have the potential to inflict injury or damage are referred as hazards. Hazards can be man-made or natural. Man-made hazards such as chemical spills or nuclear mishaps. Now, natural hazards include earthquakes, floods, and hurricane. Now let's proceed to the second one. Exposure. Now what is exposure? Exposure is the presence of elements at risk or chance of being harmed rather from a natural or man-made hazard event. Elements include the individuals, household, or communities, properties, buildings and structures, agricultural commodities, livelihoods and public facilities, infrastructures, and environment assets present in the area that are subject to potential damage or even losses. The more community is exposed to hazard factors, the higher is the disaster risk or higher chance disaster occurrence. So, exposure refers to the degree to which people, buildings, and other assets are likely to be affected by a hazard. For example, a building is located to a flood-prone area has a high exposure to a hazard of flooding. Next is vulnerability. Vulnerability means the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or assets that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard and inability of a community to prevent, mitigate, prepare for, and respond to hazardous events. Now, vulnerability refers to the susceptibility of people, buildings, and other assets to harm or damage from a hazard or disaster. Now, vulnerability is influenced by factors such as age, gender, socioeconomic status, access to infrastructure and services, and level of preparedness. Now, next is the risk. Risk implies the probability of possible adverse effects. This results from the interaction of social and environmental systems, from the combination of physical danger and exposed item vulnerabilities. Now, risk is the likelihood or probability that a hazard will cause harm or damage. It is calculated by considering the likelihoods of a hazard occurring and the potential consequences of that hazard. Next is disaster. Disaster is a serious disruption to the functioning of a community or society which causes widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses that exceed the capacity of the community or society concerned to cope with the use of their own resources. It results from the mix of hazards, risk condition, and inadequate capability or measures. Now, a disaster is a significant interruption of a community or society's ability to operate that result in significant human, material, economic, or environmental losses that are greater than what we afflicted community or society is able to recover from using its own resources. In summary, hazards are events or conditions that have the potential to cause harm or damage. Exposure refers to the degree to which people, buildings, and other assets are likely to be affected by a hazard. This is the likelihood or probability that a hazard will cause harm or damage. Now, disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society, and vulnerability refers to the susceptibility of the people, buildings, and other assets to harm or damage from hazard or disaster. This time we're going to talk about the relationship of exposure and vulnerability to each other. Exposure to hazard can make a community vulnerable, but not all communities that are exposed to hazard can be considered as vulnerable. Now, vulnerability depends on the preparedness and readiness to a hazard of the community. It depends mostly on how they mitigate, respond, and recover. If a certain community has the ability to reduce the vulnerability by reducing the risk, then the said community is already considered as less vulnerable or resilient. One of the best example here is Japan. As we all know that Japan is prone to an earthquake, they experiencing this kind of disaster almost every day. So we can say that Japan is high exposure to an earthquake. However, they are not vulnerable because Japan make a preparation about this and build a buildings or structures that has an earthquake proof. So we can say that Japan is high exposure to an earthquake, but they are not vulnerable to it. Now let us talk about the disaster mitigation. Disaster mitigation is the measure are those that eliminate or reduce the impacts and risks of hazard by means of proactive measures that taken before an emergency or disaster take place. Mitigation is the action of reducing something severity, seriousness, or painfulness. In short, it is an endeavor to limit the effects of catastrophes in order to decrease loss of life and property. Catastrophe mitigation is now crucial because it lowers the danger to lives and property and lower the expenses rather of catastrophe recovery. A hazard mitigation plan focuses attention on the dangers, disaster-prone locations, and appropriate mitigation strategies assisting communities in becoming one in becoming more sustainable and disaster resistant. Now that we're done in the module, let us answer or let you answer this last activity, which is what I have learned, so that I can know that you have learned something about this module. I'll give you 5 minutes or 3 minutes to answer this activity.